Hello again, and welcome to the third Programming the Net technical tutorial. In our previous tutorial, we looked at links and we looked at divs and spans and a few other elements that help us structure HTML better. And we ended the tutorial by scratching the surface of styles, right? We turned a piece of text into we turned the color into red, and then we turned the word into being blue. And in this tutorial, we're going to dive deeper within styling HTML using CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet, and it's kind of a complement to HTML, which tells the browser how to display various HTML elements, right? So if HTML is giving the structure and the content to the websites that we go to, CSS mostly tells them what to look like, right? It's the rules for how things should be displayed, mostly in terms of color and typography, a little bit in terms of layout, but we're going to get into all of those. So I have yet another glitch project over here. I went ahead and removed all of the unnecessary files before recording the tutorial. I recommend you do the same. Maybe pause the video right now and get it to this place where it's just index.html with the very core structure of the HTML file that we need. All right, and we're going to start by simply adding a div with a little bit of text inside. This is going to be styled. All right, and let's open a preview of our page next to the code. Right, and like right now we don't see anything different, right? There are no styles applied, and there are sort of three main ways to do styling to apply CSS within HTML, and I'm going to give you an overview of all three of them, but we're going to end up using one pretty consistently. It's good to be aware of all three though. So the first one is exactly what we did in our previous tutorial, and it's called inline styling. Inline styling means that we use the style attribute for one HTML element and write our CSS code inside of the style attributes, right? And this is called inline styling. So we explored the color CSS attribute in our CSS property, excuse me, in our previous tutorial. I'm going to do the same here, so I'm going to say color green. Right, remember that you need a semicolon after all CSS properties. And color is easy to remember. There's maybe like 20 or 30 CSS properties that we're going to get into over the course of the class. They might be a little bit hard to remember in the beginning, but with practice, you're just going to sort of get used to them and memorize them. You definitely don't have to like go through lists and memorize them like you do with a poem or anything else. They just like it comes with practice, so don't worry about it. Right, so if we had a different div with a different piece of text, let's say this is a pink text, and we can change the color to pink. All right, so this is the first way of doing styles. The second way of doing that is by adding a piece of code inside of the head, right? So if you remember, the head tag kind of includes properties about the HTML document that don't necessarily get displayed to the user directly, or like on the page per se, right? And we can add style inside of the head by using the style tag. Right, and let's say we want to, I'm going to remove the inline style for our first div. Let's say we want to make this div, we want to make the text color blue for this div. In order to do that, we need a way to address this div, right? Like we need a way to tell the code this in particular is the div that we want to apply style to. And we've run into this issue before, right? When we wanted to have linking on the same page and we needed to tell the href attribute of the A tag where exactly on the page to go. So the solution is very similar to the one that we used for links. It's coming from an attribute. In this case, it's the class attribute. Right, so like with all other attributes, we type the name of the attribute, we type equals, and then open a pair of quotes and give it a class name. And I'm just going to name it red text. All right, so nothing happened just yet, right? This class is not being used anywhere. However, if however, now we can address this div from inside of the style declaration, right? So the way to do that is by using a class selector. CSS works with selectors, and the selector, as you can guess by its name, selects parts of the HTML that a certain style would get applied to. In our case, the class selector works by typing a dot followed by the name of the class, which is red text. Right? And once we do that, we have to open and close a pair of curly braces and write our CSS code inside of this declaration, which in our case is going to be color red. Right, so we see our text turning red. Right, so like going back over what we've done, we gave our div a class, red text. We wrote a style tag inside of head. We applied the selector for the red text class using the dot in front of the class name, and we wrote our CSS code in there. Right, so this is the second way of applying styles. The third way of applying styles, which is what we're going to be using for most of this class, is very similar to the second one. However, it involves separating the style into a different file than the HTML itself. And this is mostly for organization purposes, right? Like the HTML represents the structure, the CSS represents the style. For cleanliness of the code, it's good to separate them. In order to do that, I'm going to create a new file and call it style.css. Right, this is one of the files that we removed from the original glitch project that we got. So we're slowly building back towards that. All right, style.css. Right now there's nothing in here. I'm just going to copy our style code from inside of the style tag inside of to the file, and I'm going to remove this style tag. Right, so inside of style.css, we're just going to have red text with a color red. And as you can see, our text turned back to black. And that is because we need to tell index.html where to grab its styling from. And the way to do that is by using a different tag inside of the head of the page, and that is the link tag. So we're going to say link, and notice this one doesn't have a closing. This one doesn't have a closing tag. It just works as like a single tag because there is no content inside of it. There's just attributes. And in order to tell HTML that we're going to be importing a style, we use the rel attribute, rel equals style sheet, and href equals the path towards our style. Remember href from our links, right? Href usually denotes a link within the same website or on the internet. And in this case, it's going to be /style.css. So see how our text turned red again, because right now, as the HTML page is loading, it encounters this attribute this tag in the head. It goes to the /style.css file, which is this one, grabs all of the definitions in here, and then applies them to our elements. All right. So these are the three ways of declaring styles. We can do inline, we can have the style tag inside of the header, we can have the link. However, throughout this class, we're going to be using mostly the link as a way of keeping our code clean and as a way of having our style separated from the HTML. So I'm actually going to remove this inline style now as well. All right, so now that we have a CSS file, let's look at a few other CSS properties that can be used. I'm just going to, let's just create a new div. Actually, I'm going to remove this one. Let's just create a new one, div, give it a class. Let's call it CSS tests. And let's just have like a simple word inside of there. Now, in order to give some style to this class, we need to go back into our style.css file and write some definitions for it, right? So we always start with the dot CSS tests, and just making sure I got the name right. And let's look at a few things, right? So we are familiar already with color. Maybe I got, oh, there we go. Okay, it just refreshed into blue. A few things to mention about color. You see that I'm using English words for the colors. And HTML has a few predefined colors. Sorry, CSS, not HTML. CSS Default Colors, or rather named colors. Right, so there's this quite huge collection of named colors inside of HTML that can be used by their name, right? So if we use, for example, I don't know, khaki inside of our CSS, the word highlights, right? Because HTML understands what the color is, and we see our name, our color changing. However, if we use the name of the color that doesn't exist, so for example, mustard blue, I just made that up. Right, mustard blue is not a color specified within HTML, so the style is not going to be applied. If we want to have a custom color, you're probably familiar with the fact that colors within the computer are often represented as red, green, and blue values, right? So the way electronic like in these color pickers that I'm sure you've seen in other softwares, right? The way color representation works on the computer is that there is a red component, green component, and blue component to each color. This dates back to how old monitors used to work. All of these have values between 0 and 255, and the reason it's 0 to 255 is because each color is saved on 8 bits. It kind of goes into computer architecture and other things that we're not going to cover. However, when all of them are maxed out, 255, 255, 255, we get a white. If all of them are 0, we get black, right? If green is 255 and the other are 0, we get a pure green. Same thing goes with blue. Right, and then so same thing goes with red. And then the moment we start mixing them, right, so if we have a full red with like a little bit of green, it becomes orangish. If we add a little bit of blue, I don't even know what's going to happen. Let's say 76. It becomes a slightly darker orange maybe. If we have even more blue, it becomes a pink of sorts, right? And you can usually play with these color pickers until you find something that you enjoy, and you get the RGB representation. The other thing you usually get is the hex code. What's called the hex code, and this is just the representation of these three numbers in base 16. If you remember from math classes, I don't know how many years ago, when you were talking about conversions between base 10 and base 2 and base 16 and all of that stuff, that's what this is, right? So 1D is the representation of 29 in base 16, B2 is the representation of 178, and 9E is the representation of 158. The reason I'm talking about these hex values, that's what people call them, is because that's how we can specify other colors in CSS besides the named HTML colors, right? So if we just copy and paste this aqua blue or whatever it is into our style, we need to have a hashtag in the beginning in order to tell CSS that a hex code is following, and paste our string, right? It's always going to be 6 characters, R, G, and B. All right, cool. That's most of what there is to know for now about color. Again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this. The next attribute, the next property we're going to look at is the background color. And I'm just going to come up with a color, right? So it's a dark red of sorts. That's mostly because the red value is larger than the green and the blue values. And we see that the background color of our div changed, right? And this also helps us see the shape of our div, right? We see that it's taking up the whole width of the page, which is because, as I was mentioning in a previous tutorial, the div is a block level element, right? Block level elements live on a new line and take over the whole width of their container. This is something that I think you'll internalize a little bit more as you work with divs. Let's do another example. Let's use a span, and let's give it the same class. Let's give it the same class CSS tests, right? In order to have a blue text on a dark red background. Right, so in this case, we see that the span doesn't take over the whole, doesn't take the whole width of the page, right? So if we have multiple in a row, they're just going to go one after another. The main thing to point out here is the fact that a CSS class can be used for multiple HTML elements, right? And this is very important in understanding or like in creating larger pieces of code that reuse styles. All right, so let's rename this into let's split up this class into 2 different classes. We're going to use a class that controls the background color and one that controls the color of the text. So I'm going to say, instead of CSS tests, red background and blue text. Those classes are not declared yet, right, inside of CSS, so we're not going to see anything. And maybe for the spans, one of them is going to have a red background and one of them is going to have a blue text. Right, so again, nothing is happening yet. We need to first declare them, so dot red background and then dot blue text. And I'm just going to cut and paste the attributes from our previous style, right? So as we can observe, the div has both properties applied. The first span only has a red background and the second one only has a blue text. All right, so that's all when it comes to the background color. Let's look at dimensions. CSS can also be used to control the dimensions of a div, of a span, or of any other element. As you can see, the default width for the div is the whole width of the page, and the height is kind of dictated by the size of the text. Let's make this test be square. So I'm going to create a class called square, and I'm going to give it a width of, let's say, 150 pixels and a height of also 150 pixels. Usually the dimensions are measured in pixels. There's a few other CSS units of measurement, and we're going to get into them in a further tutorial. For now, just remember that it's pixels, and remember to add the px after the number. All right, so let's give our div the square class. So I'm just going to type square in here. And you see how our div just changed shape completely and turned into a square. I'm actually going to insert a line break here so we can see the edges of the div. All right, and again, you can totally play with these values and observe the changes. All right, so let's leave it a square for now. The other thing that we can do is play with typography. We can change the font that's being used. We can change the font size and a few other things. And I'm going to create a new class. I'll just call it type example. And I'm going to add it to our div. Actually, I'll call it type style. Maybe textile. Yeah, textile is better. Naming CSS classes is always such a pain. I'm sorry for changing my mind all the time. Text style. All right, and the first property we're going to look at is font size. And this one again can be used with pixels as unit of measurement. So we can say, let's say 20 pixels. So you see the text becoming a little bit bigger. We can make it even bigger. Right, so this is one way to change the font size. However, maybe the preferred unit of measurement for the font size are points, and the point is equivalent to what you see in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word when you choose the font size, right? So if I say 12 point, it's going to be, that's kind of the default size for HTML. 14 point is a little bit bigger, 18 point is a little bit bigger, so it's a little bit more familiar, or like a little bit closer to other tools that do typography. We can also change the font using the font family property. I'm only going to show the default HTML fonts for now, and we can get into using your own custom fonts in a future tutorial. And there's three main things that we need to know here. Let's take a step back. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about typography. There are a few different categories of typefaces. The two main ones that have been around for, I don't know, hundreds of years are serif fonts and sans serif fonts. This, for example, is a serif font. Serifs are these little visual cues that you see at the edges of letters, and they're meant to help with legibility, right? They're meant to kind of help the eye distinguish where a letter ends or starts, kind of at a subconscious level when reading through a body of text, right? So these are called serifs, as opposed to sans serif, which, as you see, has very straight endings for the letter shapes. They're more geometric typefaces. Right, so in HTML we can use the default Serif Font, or we can use the default sans serif font. The other thing we can use is the default Monospace font. The Monospace is a type of font where each letter has exactly the same width, right? Like this might remind you of computer terminals or computer code. I think initially they were used a lot in early computers just because it's easier to represent letters that have the same width. It's just like easier to program, easier in terms of processing power, and now they're just a style of typography. All right, so let's make this a little bit smaller again. The other typography, the other type related CSS property that I want to talk about is the text alignment. Right, so we can have our text left aligned, center aligned, or right aligned horizontally. And we're going to talk about vertical alignment in a future tutorial. And that's the text align property. So if we say center, we see our text is going to be inside of the center of our div. If we say right, it's going to be all the way to the right. And again, this is very similar to the text alignment boxes in Google Docs or in other word editing documents. All right. Yeah, I think that's it in terms of typography for now. I want to cover a few other things, mostly related to spacing. And in order to do that, I'm going to create a few more of these divs. I'm just going to call it number 1, number 2, and number 3. Let's maybe make one of them have a yellow background and one of them have a purple background. So we need to declare those CSS classes, yellow background, and I'm just going to copy and paste the other color, but change it to yellow. And what did I say? Purple. Purple. Okay. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about spacing. As you can see, they are kind of stacked on top of each other and also at the very left edge of the page with a little bit of spacing there, which is coming from the default of the body tag. Let's say we wanted to have a little bit of space between them. One way to do that is using the margin property. And I'm going to add a new class to all of them. Let's just call it margin bottom. Actually, I changed my mind. I'm not going to add a new class to it. I'm just going to add the CSS property for margin inside of the already existing square class, right? We want all of the squares that we have to use this kind of margin. So we can say margin, and let's give it 20 pixels. Right, so we start having a 20 pixel wide area around each one of the squares. So that's what the margin does. The one thing to point out here is that the margin gets applied to all four sides of the square, right? Basically, most HTML elements behave as boxes, and this margin is enclosing the box. If we want to get a little bit more granular and assign it different margins for the top side or the left side or the right or the bottom, we can do that as well by specifying them independently. So we can say margin bottom, let's say 10 pixels, right? So then all of them start having a margin at the bottom. We can also say margin left 15. And the same way applies to margin top and margin right. We're not going to see the margin right because there's nothing after each one of the divs, but you're just going to have to believe me that there is a margin there. I'm going to remove the top and the right for now. And yeah, that's how we introduce some spacing between our elements. The next thing I'm going to talk about are borders. So you see our divs are just filled with color, the background color that we're giving them. However, they're not showing any border. If we wanted them to have a border, we can use the border attribute, the border property. And this property is a little bit more complex than the previous ones in that it takes a few different attributes, not just one. It's going to be 3 of them. The first one is the width of the border. So let's make it 3 pixels wide. The second one is the type of line. And this can be a solid line or a dashed line or a dotted line. We're going to take a look at them. And the third one is the color of the border. So you already can observe the border showing up, but if we wanted to give it a different color, let's say olive green. Is that a thing? No, that's not a color. Hot pink. Hot pink sounds great. All right, so now our 3 divs each have a border around them. We can make it thicker or even way thicker, right? So the border at this point becomes bigger than the element itself. The margins are still there as we declared them. Yeah, I'm going to tune it down to maybe 5 pixels. In terms of the different border styles, there's solid, there's dashed, right, which is just a dashed line. There's dotted, which has dots instead of the dashes, and we can Google for yeah, we can find all the different types of attributes that can go inside of that property, right? So dotted, dash, solid, double, groove, ridge. There's a few of them. Let's try double just for fun, and then you can find the rest of them by yourself. Oh wow, that looks super cool. I've never used a double border. All right, and there's one more thing I want to cover in terms of spacing, and that's the padding. So, excuse me, padding is super similar to margin in the sense that it's all about the space. However, margin deals with the space outside of the div. Padding deals with the space inside of the div, right? So the space between what's inside the contents and in the border. So if we say padding 20 pixels, you see the distance between the content and the border increasing, right? Like that space over there is called padding. And it works in a very similar way to the margin in that if we want, and like this gets applied to all 4 sides. If we want it to only get applied to one side, we can just say padding right 30 pixels. And it's only going to get applied to the right side. Same goes for padding top. And then you also notice that we don't have squares anymore, right? We have rectangles because the padding gets added to the declared width and height. So if we wanted to make them square again, we could decrease the height to be 120 pixels, right? So now we have squares with padding top for the text. And I think the best way to summarize these last 3 properties that we just talked about, the margin, the border, and the padding, is by taking a look at this thing that's called the Css Box Model. And this is really just a way to describe CSS and how the spacing works And it's a notion talking about the fact that most of HTML or most HTML elements are and act like boxes, and this is a scheme for how they work, right? So inside of a div or an element, there's a content. That element has a border. Between the content and the border, we have padding, and outside of the border, we have the margin. It's just like an easy way to visualize the things that we just talked about. Oh, one super quick thing I forgot to mention in terms of the border. We can make our borders, right now they're closing at a right angle, right? So we have squares. We can give them a border radius, which can round the edges of our squares. So if we say border radius and say, let's say 5 pixels, you see that the edges are getting a little bit round. If we just gave it 2 pixels, they would be slightly, ever so slightly rounder than a sharp corner. We could make it 20 pixels and have them be super round, or we could just make it really big, like 200 pixels, and turn our squares into circles. Yeah, so border radius is just another property to be aware of. I'm gonna keep it at, let's say 50, and have them somewhere in between a circle and a square. Great, we're almost done. One last thing that I want to show as part of this tutorial is the developer console, and this is a really helpful tool in looking at the structure of the web page, but also in prototyping CSS changes super quickly, or looking at the CSS of different websites. The way it works in most browsers, if you right click on the page and hit inspect, you're going to get a little dialog that shows in the top side the HTML of the page, right? And also, as you hover over different elements, they are going to highlight on the page itself, which is super useful in just like understanding the structure of a page. Underneath the box that's showing us the HTML, there is a styling. I'm going to close the bottom one. There's one that relates to style, right? So as we select an element, let's just select our second div, the styles dialog is going to show us the CSS for that element, right? So we see the text style that we just declared earlier with the font size, font family, and alignment, and then all of the square stuff. The cool thing about this inspect element tool is the fact that you can make changes in the style right here. So let's say we wanted to decrease our border radius, so I'd make it 5 pixels instead of 50, right? And I can see what the page looks like with a lower border radius or a different border color. Oops. However, keep in mind that the changes you make here don't get saved on the web page itself, right? They just get saved in your browser for this one session. The moment you refresh the page, they are gone, right? So this is sometimes a useful tool to just like test small changes before implementing them into the code, as long as you remember that you need to copy them over into the CSS for other websites, right? So if we were to do the same thing for an existing site, you can just right click and hit inspect element, right? And maybe we could again change the border radius of that button from 4 pixels into 40 pixels and make the buttons be more round than they were before, right? So it's a good way to explore the internet from the perspective of HTML code and CSS code. All right, I think that's it with this tutorial. We already have so much technical content for the week. Hope you enjoy all of this content, and of course, as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you all.